Good evening, everyone. And of course, I know most of you see you every third Thursday, but just in case, I'll let you know I'm Dana Schoaf, Director of Interpretation. Always glad to see you folks come in here, and it's still raining, right?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, still raining. So I was talking to many of you before out in Middletown area where I live. We had a big hail blast, and so you experienced that as well. So I just wanted to say hello, welcome, and thank you for coming here and using our facility. We really appreciate it. If you haven't, there's free copies of our member magazine. If you haven't picked one up already on the back, make sure you grab one on your way out. With that, I'll turn it over to Mr. Matt Borders.
Thank you, Ben.
Yep.
And as always, welcome once again to the Frederick County Civil War Roundtable. My name is Matt. I'm the president of the Roundtable. We have a great speaker tonight with a fantastic topic. Before we dive into that, though, we do have a couple of announcements. The Sugarloaf Alliance will be having a support for rallying against some of the construction, the data centers and things like that that are coming into the area. They're going to be having a rally for that next Wednesday. That'll be at the county council meeting. We've worked with Sugarloaf Alliance before, trying to push back against some of these various developments that are threatening not only battlefield landscape, but also viewscape. So they're encouraging us to show up for that if anybody is interested. Additionally, I've had a number of folks ask me about colleagues and whatnot in the National Park Service and the challenges that are going on currently with that. Many of you may have heard that a lot of those folks who were let go are actually being rehired or given the option to come back at this point. So that is something of good news. We're going to see how things continue on that front. So stay tuned there. But we do appreciate that support. Continue to support your National Park Service sites and, of course, your State Park Service sites as well. Now, I want to jump right into the speaker this evening. Betty Shideler is a longtime researcher on the American Civil War with a focus on civilian stories and, of course, death and mourning. Now, she has worked with the United Daughters of the Confederacy. She's also done certificate programs with the American Battlefield Trust. And she is joining us tonight to speak on just this topic of death and mourning in the American Civil War. So let's give her a big round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, so much. I really appreciate the invitation to this beautiful museum. And I will be, my friend Debbie and I will be touring the museum tomorrow on a couple of the battlefields in the area and so on. I'm going to go right into my talk, Death and Mourning in the Civil War. So the American Civil War was the first modern war. And throughout the 4 years of this deadliest war, our perception of death and mourning would change dramatically. What started out as a lark for many would eventually claim the lives of approximately 750,000 men. Nobody could have predicted that the war would drag on for 4 long years, or that battles such as Shiloh, Stones River, Antietam, and Gettysburg would bring devastating death and destruction. Now, prior to the war, funerals were very private family affairs. Family members were left to dress and prepare the body, which was displayed in the home parlor. And because of decomposition, funerals were held pretty quickly. Many communities had women groups that helped lay the dead to rest. And death was no stranger to the living. Infant mortality was extremely high. Women died in childbirth routinely, and many more died of diseases of the day. So during this time, the country was a Christian nation, and the belief was one of a good death. The good death is based on the premise that a person is ready for death, the dying expected to be surrounded by loved ones, prayers would be offered up, and they would be buried in either a family plot or a local church cemetery. It was thought that the person dying would apologize for wrongs done during their life or impart some words of wisdom that one only discovers when near death. Certainly, before the war, a wife was expected to sit beside a bedside, holding her husband's hand, and watch him die after a long, fulfilling life. If one had led such a life, they would undoubtedly be rewarded with a pain-free life in heaven, whole in body, and recognizable upon being reunited with other loved ones. While the war raged, this notion of a good death would be impossible to be observed. Men were killed suddenly, often with no time to prepare for death. It would change our entire perspective on death. You will discover that the country was ill-prepared for war. The Victorian era also had a profound impact on funeral practices, which emphasized mourning rituals and beautification of death. Mourning attire, jewelry, and extensive use of Black clothing and home decor became standard practice during this time. And I'll discuss that a little bit later. The idea of a body resting far from home, or worse, in enemy soil, was unacceptable. The task of bringing a loved one's body back home fell on women, and this work began once she had a place to mourn. If a widow could manage to locate the body, she felt a responsibility to bring him back home, to be close to family and friends who knew him. Before going into a particular battle, soldiers would write letters home saying goodbye to their families, or wrote letters as they were dying from wounds received. They often entrusted their fellow soldiers to contact family members should their mate die in battle. With men dying by the hundreds and thousands miles from home, strangers increasingly performed many of the rites associated with death. So many soldiers had died on the battlefield and were not given proper burials that it was only natural that families who were able wanted to give their dead special treatment. Now, there was no plan for identification of the dead. It was the responsibility of commanding officers to make a list of deceased soldiers, but this often proved difficult because the soldier did not have any form of identification on him, and the sheer numbers of dead just really made this difficult, if not impossible. And you'll remember that there were no dog tags at that time. The war would bring about growing appearance of morticians or funeral directors, as we know them today, who used their homes as the viewing location of the bodies. As deaths increased over time, funeral homes became accepted by families. The Civil War also saw the growth of coffin and casket makers. Hexagonal shapes were preferred, and a simple pine coffin cost about $2 or $3. With the large number of deaths, it was necessary to have coffins made mass-produced. Now, metal coffins were introduced just prior to the Civil War, but they were extremely heavy. They could weigh up to 300 pounds, and they cost about $40 or $50. So they really only started gaining in popularity in about World War I. There was also no official method of notifying next of kin. So this often fell, I think I'm behind my pictures, sorry. This one is obviously has a viewing window in it, and that was to help the families identify their loved ones. There was no official method of notifying next of kin. So this often fell to fellow soldiers of the deceased, who took it upon themselves to let families know of the noble death of their loved ones. Often a family would not know that their loved one had died for weeks, months, and some never came back. Now in March 1865, Clara Barton received permission to open the missing soldiers office. When she finished her work in 1868, she and her staff had been able to determine what had happened to more than 22,000 soldiers. There were no comparable offices in the South. Preparing bodies for transport home. Embalming had previously been used only in medical training, but became necessary during the war to prepare bodies for transport. So bodies would be removed from the battlefield, embalmed, and then sent back to the family for a nominal fee. Embalming stations were set up by the U.S. Army that enabled the preservation of a soldier's body for his journey home until such time as his family could say goodbye. Bodies were transported by train, and embalming helped with this so that passengers on the train would not be disturbed by the smell. Embalming had just started to come into its own during the war and was offered as a method to ward off decomposition and allow times for the bodies to be transported home, often over a long distance. An enlisted man's family was charged about $7, while an officer's family could expect to pay about $13, although many embalmers really took advantage. We had scammers back then too. Burying the dead. By the early 19th century, colonial burial grounds and churchyards located in towns and cities were becoming overcrowded and neglected. These cemeteries were full of images of skulls and crossbones, skeletons, and other symbols of fear. To counter this, and in keeping with the romantic sentiments of the Victorian age, the rural cemetery set away from the town emerged. Planners designed these cemeteries as park-like settings that encouraged guests to wander paths, contemplate the solemnity of death, and feel God's presence in nature. Indeed, these cemeteries became our first public parks, and picnickers and nature lovers alike enjoyed strolling through the grounds. Ornamental benches, fencing, urns, and cemetery art included angels on tombstones, all with the view of making a more comfortable setting. I think you can probably see the angel on top of that, and you can see it's very beautiful. The fear was no longer of death itself, but of having lived undesired and unlamented. It was becoming important that mourners go to great lengths to demonstrate their open love and affection for the deceased. In February 1867, Congress would pass the National Reburial Initiative, whose purpose was to provide authority and funds necessary to establish national cemeteries with common landscape designs. Cemeteries were established at battlefield sites at Fredericksburg and Richmond, Virginia, Chattanooga and Shiloh, Tennessee, and numerous other places where federal dead still lay scattered in nearly forgotten graves. Indeed, when Abraham Lincoln gave his Gettysburg Address on November 19, 1863, there were bodies scattered around the battlefields more than 4 months after the fighting ended. Even as late as the 1870s, many bodies still lay on battlefields. $4 million was spent to accomplish this. That equals about $75 million in today's money. There was no such accommodation for Confederate soldiers, who often lay in shallow graves on battlefields, waiting to be found and transported to their homes. This became the task of Southern women, who formed memorial associations and lady aid societies. The first such society was formed in 1865 in Winchester, Virginia. By 1868, there were 20 such organizations, many of them in Virginia. One group that made great strides in locating and reburying the Confederate dead was the Ladies Hollywood Memorial Association, who brought back and reburied approximately 3,000 Confederate soldiers from the fields of Gettysburg. They were able to raise funds primarily through private donations. It's estimated that nearly half of the Civil War dead were never identified. This was made up of 149,000 of the 325,000 Union dead. The number of unknown Confederate soldiers is higher than those of the Union troops, although exact numbers are not known. And about 2/3 of those who served with the United States colored troops remain unidentified. So how many women were widowed as a result of the war? Also having a huge impact on women was the sheer number who found themselves widowed as a result of the horrific death toll. During the 4 years of the war, approximately 3 million husbands, fathers, sons, uncles, and brothers left for war. And that number represented about 1/10 of the population of the country. With a death toll of 750,000, that meant that the same number of American families would never see their loved ones' face again, as the men died often far from home. It is estimated that 200,000 women became widows as a result of the Civil War, higher than any other war. This also means that the number of children orphaned by the war could be as high as 400,000 if we use the statistics of who these widows were. Etiquette books recommended that mothers mourn a child for 1 year, a child mourn a parent for 1 year, and siblings mourn for 6 months. Children left orphaned by the war wore white in summer and gray in the winter months. Widowers mourned for only 3 months by wearing armbands, badges, or rosettes of black fabric. Remember, men were the breadwinners of the family, therefore they were given leeway when it came to mourning. In addition, if these men had children, they would often marry shortly after the death of their wives. Widows, however, were expected to respect a 2-year and 6-week in mourning. In the period immediately following the death of her husband, a wife embarked on full or deep mourning, in which she was compelled to wear only black clothing and to keep her face concealed by a black crepe veil when she left her home. This would be worn for a father, mother, grandfather, grandmother, husband, wife, and brother and sister, according to the Gentleman and Ladies Book of Politeness, and confirmed by George Winfred Hervey in the Principles of Courtesy. A widow in deep mourning could not go out in public except to attend church. Next came a period known as half mourning, during which the widow continued to wear black or solid dark colors, such as lavender, gray, and some purples, and a short veil or bonnet, but lighter shades of lace and cuffs were allowed to adorn her outfit. Dresses could be trimmed with frills, and flowers could now adorn a bonnet, according to an 1864 copy of Godey's Lady's Book. For women, this meant stocking their armoire with mourning fashion, which was more readily available in the North, even though its death toll was 1/3 of that of the Confederacy. And of course, remember, there was the blockades anyway. It was very hard for Southern women to get fabric. Stores like Lord & Taylor opened a mourning store where new widows could dress their grief fashionably. Godey's Lady's Book, the equivalent of today's Vogue magazine, regularly printed drawings of bonnets, collars, sleeves, breakfast caps, and a variety of mourning dresses for all occasions. Widows of Union soldiers from big cities were also known to wear more flamboyant widows' weeds than did their equals in the South. Enslaved blacks working in wealthier homes also would have worn black clothing. Jewelry was forbidden unless it was made of accepted materials, usually jet black or tokens containing a lock of the deceased's hair. In addition, widows were to avoid social functions and correspond. Oh, here's the jewelry. I apologize. Just to give you an example. Jewelry was forbidden. In addition, widows were to avoid social functions and correspond only on appropriate black-lined stationery. So despite suggested protocol, how can one determine the correct period of mourning for a widow? Many widows, including Mary Todd Lincoln and Mary Anna Jackson, wore mourning clothes for the remainder of their lives. George Winfred Hervey said in The Principles of Courtesy, "There should be nothing in mourning but what is natural and spontaneous. It is equal dissimulation to conceal the sorrow we feel and to feign the sorrow we cannot feel. Besides, what is more absurd than weeping by rule and wearing mourning according to fashion?" So who were these women? For Virginia women who had been married to Confederate soldiers, the women generally were married only about 6 years and were 27 years old. In a time when families were composed of 6 to 10 children, these widows only had a median number of 2 children due to their very short marriages. The youngest widows were likely to marry again, but obviously found a shortage of men because of the war. So they either married very young men or men much older than themselves. They also found it very difficult to find husbands of the same demographic and class background as themselves. Middle-aged widows were far less likely to remarry, but this largely can be explained by the fact that they were more likely to own property, and they also had older children who could take care of and provide aid and labor. So hence many widows who did not remarry did that by choice. There was little opportunity for work outside the home to the women in the South due to its rural economy. If women did find work, it was most likely as dressmakers, weavers, or spinners of cloth. Pensions offered to Southern widows was quite small compared to their compatriots in the North, who received about 3 times more from the federal government. Because so many of the battles of the Civil War took place in the South, widowhood was more prevalent and more visible there, which had not one widow, but many. On December 18, 1862, in Virginia, Lucy Breckinridge, who would eventually lose 3 brothers to the war, found herself surrounded by 14 ladies dressed in black and remarked, "There were so many ladies there, all dressed in deep mourning, that we felt that we were in a convent and formed a sisterhood." By the end of the war, approximately 179,000 black men were serving in the military. That was about 10% of the Union troops. Nearly 40,000 died as a result of disease or battle wounds. Enslaved blacks were allowed to mourn their dead. However, these were not sad events, but joyous occasions celebrated with food, dancing, and singing. The deceased no longer had to endure pain, hardship, and injustice. They did mourn, of course, but first and foremost, it was a celebration of the person being free. Women were still in charge of planning the funeral and rituals associated with death. They would invite all their friends, relatives, and neighbors to attend the funeral, and the funeral might actually even be postponed if someone couldn't make it. Weather played a very important role. Sunny days were preferred. If it was raining or storming, they believed that the devil was taking the deceased soul. These widows also wore black, although the color blue played an important role. and many women wore glass beads as adornment. In cemeteries, Blacks not only used floral arrangements and markers similar to their white counterparts, but the graves were adorned with items which had belonged to the deceased, such as a clock, vase, cups, piggy banks, and more. Often items such as seashells and pebbles were placed, which suggests the watering environment at the bottom of the ocean, lake, or river. And this was a practice not related to Christian belief in salvation that was adopted by Blacks, because they did become Christian, they did adopt the Christian faith, but rather the remembrance of their African customs. If you go to most countries in Africa, you'll see there is a deep connection with water. Want to talk about a few of the, some stories of the widows. Hetty Carey and John Pegram. Hetty was a Richmond socialite who sided with the Confederacy. She was much like the fictional character Scarlett O'Hara in Gone with the Wind. She was considered the belle of the ball. On one such occasion, she met the handsome John Pegram, a West Point graduate. They fell in love and were married on January 19, 1865. After a quick honeymoon, John returned to the field and was killed at the Battle of Hatcher's Run on February 6, 1865. His funeral was held in the same church where a mere 3 weeks earlier he had married Hetty. Nellie Richmond and Stephen Ramseur. At 27 years old, Stephen Ramseur was the youngest West Point graduate to attain the rank of Major General. He was married to his wife for less than a year and had just received word on the birth of his daughter. He was killed during the Battle of Cedar Creek. Mary Anna Morrison and Thomas J. Jackson. Anna was the second wife of General Jackson, and they married in 1857. He would meet his infant daughter for the first time on April 20th, 1863. When her husband was wounded at the Battle of Chancellorsville, she traveled there with her infant daughter to see him, and both were present when he died. Stonewall had only spent a short period of time with his infant daughter before he passed. Anna never remarried, but returned to live with her father and daughter in North Carolina. Jane Patterson and Sergeant Miles Casey. Company K, 108th New York Infantry, color bearer, married Jane in 1855, and they had one child, Michael John Casey. Miles was severely wounded at Antietam and succumbed to his wounds on September 30th, 1862, leaving Jane to raise a 4-year-old son on her own. Mary Todd Lincoln. She was married to Abraham Lincoln, who served as President of the United States from 1861 until his assassination on April 15, 1865. They had married on April 4th, 1842 in Springfield, Illinois. Their life together has been well documented. But after the president was shot, Mary was banished from his bedside as she was crying hysterically. She was not with her husband when he died. She continued her erratic behavior, and people came to see her as an improper woman. This just was not acceptable behavior for a widow. And she had previously lost 2 young sons, and she was kind of showing the symptoms of what we would later call being bipolar. The new president, Andrew Johnson, did not offer his condolences either through a visit or note of sympathy. Mary was hurt by this and actually thought that Johnson may have had something to do with her husband's assassination. Johnson did delay moving into the White House to allow her some time to collect herself, and she certainly took her time doing so. But she eventually moved into a hotel in Chicago. She did not accompany her husband's body on the train, nor did she attend the funeral as she was too distraught. She wore mourning garb for the rest of her life. I've included Captain Sullivan Ballou in here. On the back table, I have a copy of the letter that he wrote to his wife just before he went into battle. His words are incredibly moving, and I think that gives us an idea of what the soldiers were probably thinking before they went into a battle, thinking about their loved ones far away. He was critically wounded at the Battle of Manassas, Bull Run, and died in a makeshift hospital at Sudley Church, Virginia, on July 26, 1861. His body was later exhumed, and eventually he was buried at Swan Point Cemetery in Providence. His wife, Sarah, lived for another 56 years and never remarried. She is buried beside her husband. And as I said, you can pick up a copy of that. If that's the last part of the death and mourning aspect, but in honor of Women's History Month, if you can just indulge me a few more minutes, I just want to talk about some notable women of the war. Caregivers Jessie Rupert and Eliza Krim. Even though Jessie married a man sympathetic to the Confederate cause, they both provided care for wounded soldiers, both Union and Confederacy, in her home in Newmarket. She earned the nickname Daughter of the 34th Regiment for her part in rescuing the battalion flag. Eliza Krim was a young woman also living in Newmarket when the war came to her town. After the battle, the VMI cadets were taken to Krim's home, where she cared for them and provided food. She was given the nickname Mother of the Newmarket Cadets. We have nurses, Louisa May Alcott and Phoebe Pember. You probably know Louisa May Alcott as an author, but she also served for a period of time as a nurse during the war years. She actually contracted typhoid and was forced to retire from nursing, and she actually never recovered from that illness. Phoebe Pember was the chief matron of the Chimborazo Hospital. It was one of the largest hospitals in the world. Female soldiers. The top is Loretta Janetta Velasquez, and I hope I pronounced her last name correctly. And the bottom is Frances Louisa Clayton, also known as Jack Williams. So Loretta disguised herself and joined the Confederate States Army. When her identity was revealed, of course, she was kicked out, but she later re-enlisted and fought in the Battle of Shiloh. She would later become a spy and then a double agent for the U.S. Secret Service. Frances was from Minnesota and disguised herself as a soldier in the United States Army during the Civil War and served alongside her husband. She also fought in a number of battles. More spies, Harriet Tubman, Rose O'Neal Greenhow. Harriet, of course, is well known for her role as conductor for the Underground Railroad, but she also acted as a spy, uncovering important information about the Confederate position, where they had placed torpedoes in the water, and she was helpful in gaining the freedom of 750 enslaved people, along with Colonel James Montgomery. Rose provided a secret message to General Pierre G.T. Beauregard that would ultimately help him win the Battle of Bull Run. We also have Elizabeth Van Loo and Belle Boyd. Elizabeth ran a network of spies from her home in Richmond, gathering intelligence and aiding Union prisoners of war. Belle Boyd was a very attractive young woman who was able to infiltrate Union camps and gather invaluable information to pass to Confederate officers, including Stonewall Jackson. She was arrested on a number of occasions and was finally imprisoned at the old Capitol Prison in Washington, D.C. Just some people that you may want to read a little bit more about. So thank you once again. I'm happy to take questions. I hope I have all the answers for you. Thank you. Anybody?
Bet I've got one.
Sure.
How did you put we talked a little bit about this at dinner, but how did you put your research together for the presentation and for your ongoing work that you're doing?
Just a lot of research, going to different websites. The hardest, and books and so on, I really read a lot of material. The hardest part, I wish I had more information, finding out about Black women who were left widowed and so on, even their influence in the war. Just a very, very little bit of information is available, not a lot known. So I tried to piece together, what I could. So, but yeah, it's just been, I think I've been researching for, I don't know, a number of years. Yeah, so, yes.
You talked a little bit about this, but was there prescribed periods? You know, when you say they had to be in deep mourning, and then they moved into
Half mourning,
half mourning.
yes.
How long did deep mourning last? You know, how long did half mourning last?
About a year, and then the second stage was probably about the same, a year, and then a little bit less. As I mentioned, though, honestly, there were, the younger women, the younger widows, definitely, they were like Scarlett O'Hara. They wanted a life and somebody to take care of them. So they were a little bit more out there, and they may not have worn the requisite clothing for a long period of time and so on. But yeah, so about 2 years. I've run into, there's even controversy there. Some people say it's 2.5 years. Some say, mine I think today said 2 years and 6 weeks. But really, who's to put a price on, whether somebody really, really loved their husband, they would stay in mourning for quite some time. But that's really what the etiquette books said they really should be doing. And it was important, I think I mentioned this just ever so briefly. It was important for these widows to openly show their level of mourning for their spouse and so on. It really became a symbol, I think probably more so in the South than the North. But did that answer your question?
Yeah.
Yes, in the back, yeah.
So were there any mourning rituals for men?
They wore, if they really followed, it was supposed to be 3 months. Some did it for a couple of weeks. They would mourn just wear a black band or a black rosette. That is it.
So guys got off a lot.
They got off a lot easier, yes. But again, as I said, especially if they had children. I mean, even at the time in the early 1900s, when my grandfather would have been around, he married his second wife. He had, I think, 5 or 6 children at home. He couldn't stay home with them. So the right thing to do was to marry someone, and she had a couple of children as well. So people did it even fairly recently, but it was big in the war. Yes, that's right.
Laudanum and opium use skyrocketed during the war, both in males and females. In latter days, the blockade runners was primarily drugs being brought in. Have you looked into the effects of that long-term drug overdosing on women of that period?
I didn't really talk about that a lot, but of course, a lot of the women were smuggling, particularly the Southern women, because of the blockades and so on. And they used their hoop skirts, and they put bottles of laudanum and so on in their skirts and so on. It wasn't really a drug like you're thinking, they're smuggling drugs and so on. It really was for a medicinal purpose. And of course, many of them became addicted, yes. Oh, absolutely. Yeah, some good material to add to my talk in the future and so on. But yeah, thank you for that. Yes.
Yes, you talked about the casket makers, and what did you say they were like $2? I'm sorry.
$2-3.
Okay.
Yeah.
So then if you knew that, say, your husband died or your brother or something, then if you had the wherewithal, you would go and get the body, but you would have to arrange a casket for them?
Yes, if you could, women had to travel to, and if they even knew, they found out, and like I said, they had Clara Barton, who she and her staff answered thousands and thousands of letters from family. She didn't find all those men, but she was able to help them somewhat and so on. That was a monumental task in itself. But yes, they would have had to find the body and either have it transported to them, or they would go and they would bring the body back.
And so that's where the funeral home.
Exactly.
They would get the bodies maybe right to the family, embalm them. And
Exactly,
and
yes.
put the money, stain them, whatever. Okay.
Yes, yeah. So you're,
If you have the wherewithal.
yes. Well, the money was very important. It did cost money, and the average soldier, I don't know what they were making. I guess but it was like $2 and $3 was a lot of money for them.
Most of them probably were farmers. I mean, it was
Exactly.
quite a rural.
Especially from the South. Yeah, it was a very rural economy. Unlike, the North had businesses and industries and so on. Yes.
And just follow up on that, Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr. wrote a very interesting story about going to try to find his son at Antietam. It's called My Captain. It's in Atlantic Magazine, I believe in 1863. It's available online.
Yes.
But he tells an amazing story about coming into Antietam and going out there and looking for his son. He talks about all the women in other families who are canvassing the battlefield and the hospitals around here trying to find their sons, fathers, uncles, etc.
Yeah,
It's a really good source.
Yeah. And, again, like I said, so the embalmers were kind of taking advantage of people, and they may not have even been proper embalmers. That was a fairly new method. And, but there were people that they might have found a body or a piece of jewelry or clothing or something, and they would charge these families, I'll tell you where the body is if you pay me so much money. So it seems like there's always been people taking advantage of tragedies and so on, But yeah, that article that's a really good article. But can you imagine just walking over? I think there were 23,000 men killed at Antietam, so, and they just lay in the field. 1870s, there were still bodies on the fields, just, rotting. So even those embalmers, and they put them in the caskets and so on, that didn't necessarily, really work. And sometimes it wasn't even really the right person that was in there. And some of those bodies kind of, the bloating and stuff, yeah. It was not pleasant. Yes, right here.
I seem to recall from the Ken Burns series that there were certain positions you were supposed to be in, the toes of your socks pinned together, your arms crossed, and a soldier who knew he was about to die would look at the nurse who wrote a book and say, "Now fix me."
Yeah, I have,
Whatever,
yes,
in the right position.
yes.
So what all would that position consist of?
I don't have all the answers of that, but yes, it would have been the hands crossed. I do know when, so if they were taking a body out of a parlor, a home parlor, the feet went first. That was a superstition. They covered the mirrors with black cloth because, the devil could see your image and so on. They stopped the clocks. There were all sorts of unusual things that the Victorians did. But they really had this idea that when you went to heaven, and they all assumed they were all going to heaven, your body would be whole, and you would recognize your loved ones, and you would be pain-free and so on. So they really had that connection with death. And back.
So there's a lot of photography too of dead
Oh.
children and children, is that part of their sort of ritual of saying goodbye, or?
Oh, yes. So of the children,
Yeah, the postmortem photography.
yes. Well, and of course, that photography was fairly new,
Right.
but that was something that they believed in, yeah. And like I said, I've known people who were older individuals, and they did that even into the 1920s and 30s. They took pictures of little babies sleeping, appearing to be sleeping and so on. Yeah, they had a fascination with death, and they weren't afraid of dying per se. It's just, that they had this close affection with death, and they wanted it to be remembered as peaceful and so on. Yes, Nora.
With the number of missing and misplaced soldiers after the war, is there going to be a typical, people want confirmation before they begin the period of mourning? And is there going to be a lot of denial of that they're just missing?
I'm sure there was, and I think to myself, so you're waiting, and even today, I think after 7 years, and they may have changed that now, you can have somebody declared dead. Obviously, I don't think they had that then. But no, so they're waiting back home. They don't necessarily, unless somebody has written a letter to them, which a lot of the soldiers did do. And they said, I was with your son, brother, whatever, when he passed, and I can tell you he died a noble death. So they gave some, but no, for a lot of them, there was never closure, because they just didn't, even today, somebody, a person disappears, and if you don't have a body, you just.
So would you see, would anybody, with the denial part, would there be a refusal to admit that, and they wouldn't do a period of mourning?
Sure, yeah. I guess after, and maybe that went on for a certain period of time, and then, and maybe, like I said, the denial may have gone on for their entire life. But I personally can't imagine not having, yes.
A quick comment, on your question, the scale of death because of the war was so much larger and more vast than this country ever experienced.
Yeah.
It kind of shattered some of these regimes and changed things because people just didn't know and they had to move on.
Absolutely. Yes.
You just added another point to that. You think about it, there were 750,000 roughly people killed outside of a population of 30 million. That would be equivalent of losing 7.5 million today.
Exactly. I know.
If you think about it, we lost about 1 million during COVID,
Uh-huh.
and we haven't recovered from that.
Yeah.
And you think of the mental aspect of that must have just been.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Just think of the impact of that had
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Oh, in so many ways, yes. Yeah.
generational.
Uh-huh.
Well, a great topic for a kind of a gloomy day.
Yes, and a fitting location. Thank you, everybody.
Please join us next month, everybody. We're going to have National Park Service Ranger Brian Barris from Antietam National Battlefield speaking to us about George Sears Green and the 12th Corps actions in the East Woods. So